It was one of those Friday afternoons where the city seemed to move slower, the golden sunlight spilling across the pavement. On the corner of Maple Street, just shy of Bridgeport's bustling downtown, Officer Greg Turner lounged in his cruiser, finishing the last sips of a lukewarm coffee. Greg wasn't your textbook officer of the law. He wore his badge not as a symbol of service, but as a crown of unchecked authority. Today, that very badge would lead him into a storm he never saw coming. Across the street, a man exited a cafe, his sharp black suit contrasting with the casual atmosphere of the day. His name was Elijah Carter, a man whose demeanor radiated confidence and composure. Though he'd grown up in Bridgeport, Elijah had spent years building a career in another city. What the people around him didn't know, what Greg certainly didn't know, was that Elijah was returning to Bridgeport not as a visitor, but as the newly appointed captain of the very precinct Greg served in. That revelation, however, was still a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. Elijah stepped off the curb, his stride purposeful as he crossed the street. Greg, watching him from his patrol car, felt a spark of irritation. Something about the man's poise rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way Elijah carried himself with quiet authority, or maybe Greg simply needed a target to remind himself of the power he thought his badge granted him. Setting his coffee cup down, Greg swung open the car door with more force than necessary and stepped onto the pavement. He stomped toward Elijah, with the air of someone ready to pick a fight. "Hey, you! What are you doing round here?" Greg's voice cut through the afternoon air, sharp and confrontational. Elijah stopped in his tracks, his calm gaze meeting Greg's agitated one. "Just heading to a meeting," Elijah replied evenly, his tone respectful but firm. Greg wasn't in the mood for respectful replies. "You look like you're up to something," he sneered, his hand resting on his belt. "Let's see some ID." Without breaking eye contact, Elijah reached into his jacket, moving deliberately so there'd be no misunderstanding. "Of course, officer," he said, his voice steady. "Happy to show you my ID." But before Elijah could fully pull out his wallet, Greg's irritation boiled over. "You think you can talk to me like that? Like you're somebody special?" he growled, stepping closer. And then, without warning, Greg's fist shot forward, connecting hard with Elijah's face. The force of the punch rocked Elijah, but he didn't fall. He staggered back a step, steadying himself with one hand. Around them, a handful of pedestrians froze, their shock evident as they witnessed the unprovoked attack. Greg smirked, pleased with himself. "Maybe now you'll learn to show some respect," he said, his tone dripping with smugness. He turned, ready to walk back to his patrol car, confident he'd just put another man in his place. But Elijah wasn't done. Straightening up, he wiped the corner of his mouth where Greg's fist had landed and took a step forward. His calm composure was replaced with something colder, sharper, a quiet fury that demanded attention. "Big mistake," Elijah said, his voice low but commanding. Greg paused mid-step, turning back with a scoff. "Oh yeah, and what mistake's that?" he shot back, still unaware of the storm he'd just unleashed. Elijah's eyes locked onto Greg's, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority. "I'm Captain Elijah Carter," he said, his words landing like a hammer. "Your new captain." Greg's expression froze, the blood draining from his face. What? He stammered, the bravado slipping from his voice. "You heard me," Elijah continued, his tone unyielding. "I'm the new captain of this precinct, and you just assaulted me." The color in Greg's cheeks vanished entirely, replaced by sheer panic. His mouth opened but no words came out. He blinked, struggling to process what Elijah had just said. Elijah didn't wait for Greg to recover. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out his wallet and flipped it open, displaying his credentials with precise, deliberate movements. "Here's my ID, Officer Turner," he said, holding it up for Greg to see. "You want to try calling this a misunderstanding?" Greg's knees felt weak as he stared at the ID. The badge, the name. It all matched. Elijah leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make his next words even more chilling. You assaulted a superior officer in broad daylight. There's no walking away from this. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of distant traffic. The pedestrians who had stopped to watch the scene whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of disbelief and judgment. Greg finally managed to stammer, I didn't know. That's obvious. Elijah cut him off sharply. But ignorance doesn't excuse what you just did. You're going to face the consequences. Greg's head spun, his earlier arrogance now replaced by the crushing weight of dread. The power he thought he held had evaporated, leaving him exposed and defenseless. As Elijah turned to address the murmuring crowd, Greg's world collapsed. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. It was a busy Friday afternoon on the corner of Maple and Fifth Avenue, where the city of Bridgeport hummed with its usual rhythm. The air carried the faint aroma of fresh coffee. Laughter echoed from a nearby cafe, and car horns punctuated the chatter of pedestrians. Amid this urban symphony, Officer Greg Matheson sat in his patrol car, gripping his coffee cup like a scepter, surveying his domain with a sense of authority that often veered into arrogance. Greg wasn't the kind of cop you'd want to cross paths with. His badge seemed to embolden his worst instincts. But what he didn't know was that this particular day would change everything for him, and not in the way he expected. Across the street, the cafe door swung open, and a man stepped out, smoothing his dark suit with practiced ease. His name was Marcus Harris, a sharp, composed individual who walked with the kind of confidence that drew attention without demanding it. Marcus had lived in Bridgeport as a young man, but life had taken him elsewhere for years. Today, though, Mark had taken him elsewhere for years. Today, though, Mark had taken a significant promotion. Captain of the very precinct Greg worked in. As Marcus crossed the street, Greg's sharp gaze locked onto him. Something about the man's composed demeanor irked him. The way Marcus carried himself, unbothered and self-assured, was enough to trigger Greg's penchant for confrontation. He tossed the last of his coffee onto the pavement, wiped his hands on his uniform, and stepped out of the car with a door slam that echoed like a warning shot. Greg marched across the street, his expression a mixture of irritation and determination. "Hey, you there!" Greg barked, his voice cutting through the ambient city noise. He planted himself squarely in Marcus's path, glaring at the man as if his very existence was an affront. Marcus stopped, raising an eyebrow in surprise. His calmness didn't falter as he replied, "Can I help you, officer?" "What are you doing around here?" Greg demanded, leaning forward slightly, his tone more accusatory than curious. Marcus gestured toward his destination. "I'm heading to a meeting. Is there a problem?" Greg sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you're up to something," he said, a twisted smirk forming. "Let me see some ID." With a steady hand, Marcus reached into his jacket, his movements deliberately slow to avoid escalating the situation. "Sure thing," he replied evenly, his voice unshaken. But before Marcus could retrieve his wallet, Greg's simmering hostility boiled over. "You think you're better than me?" Greg snarled, stepping closer. Before Marcus could respond, Greg's fist flew, connecting with Marcus's face in a vicious punch that left the passers-by gasping in shock. Marcus staggered but didn't fall. He steadied himself, one hand instinctively touching the spot where Greg's fist had landed. The crowd around them buzzed with disbelief, their murmurs punctuated by the faint clicks of smartphones capturing the moment. Greg smirked, still riding the wave of his self-righteousness. "Maybe that'll teach you some respect," he said, turning as if the matter were settled. But Marcus wasn't done. He stood tall, his voice calm but cutting as he said, "You just made a huge mistake." Greg froze mid-step, his smirk faltering. He turned back, his expression caught between confusion and irritation. "Oh yeah? And what mistake is that?" "I'm Captain Marcus Harris," Marcus said, his words landing like a hammer. "Your new commanding officer." The color drained from Greg's face. For a moment he stood there, blinking as if trying to process the enormity of his blunder. "What?" he stammered, his voice cracking. Marcus reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out his badge and holding it up for Greg to see. "I think this clears up who I am," Marcus said coolly. "And let me make something else clear. You just assaulted your superior officer. I'll be pressing charges." The smugness vanished from Greg's face, replaced by sheer panic. He stammered incoherently, his usual bravado evaporating as the weight of the situation crushed him. Marcus, unshaken, pulled out his phone and dialed. "This is Captain Harris," he said calmly. "I need a unit at Maple and 5th. Officer Matheson has assaulted me, and I'll be filing charges." Greg's chest tightened as the reality of the situation sank in. Around them, murmurs turned to whispers, and several onlookers continued recording. Greg's world seemed to close in on him as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 squad cars arrived, and familiar faces stepped out. Sergeant Parker, a veteran officer with a reputation for no-nonsense professionalism, led the group. She greeted Marcus with a nod, before turning her sharp gaze to Greg. "Officer Matheson," she said sternly, "is what Captain Harris said true?" Greg stammered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know." Parker didn't let him finish. "Doesn't matter, you assaulted a superior. Cuff him." Greg's colleagues stepped forward, their expressions unreadable as they placed him in handcuffs. For the first time, Greg felt the cold sting of accountability. Marcus watched silently as Greg was led away, his composure unbroken. "Handle this by the book, Sergeant," Marcus instructed. "I believe Greg will find this difficult to do." Parker nodded. "Of course, Captain." Greg sat in the squad car, staring blankly at the dashboard as his career unraveled. The badge he had wielded with such arrogance now felt heavier than ever, a symbol of his downfall. Thank you for sticking around until the end. If this story gripped you, be sure to hit that like button and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories like this. See you in the next one.